Hey y'all, it's entry number 61 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Deebo Samuel, wide receiver, San Francisco 49ers. We'll start with some of the positives from Deebo Samuel's fantasy profile. 2021 fantasy consistency. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Deebo Samuel had 0 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 4 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 4 out of 16 games with over 25 fantasy points, according to fantasy data. Not many wide receivers or running backs have shown as high a floor as Deebo Samuel. In just 12.5% of his games, he had under 10 fantasy points, and 0% under 5 fantasy points, which makes it a lot easier to trust him in your lineups on a week-to-week basis. The next thing I really like about Deebo Samuel's fantasy profile is that he's a rare dual-threat wide receiver. Deebo Samuel is one of the most unique wide receivers in the NFL because besides being a strong receiving threat who caught 77 passes on 121 targets for 1,405 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns in 2021, he is also a guy that will get some carries on the ground as well, as shown by his 59 carry, 365 rushing yard, and 8 rushing touchdown season in 2021. This gives Deebo 2 sources to get fantasy points, which raises both his fantasy floor and ceiling. The last thing I really like about Deebo Samuel's fantasy profile is his yards after the catch ability. Deebo Samuel has been one of the best wide receivers in the NFL in the yards after the catch department over the course of his NFL career thus far. During the 2020 NFL season, Deebo Samuel averaged 12.1 yards after the catch per reception, the best mark in the NFL, and had 398 yards after the catch on the year, which was the 23rd best in the NFL, which is insane because he played just 7 games. During the 2021 season, Samuel averaged 10.0 yards after the catch per reception, the 4th best mark in the NFL, and had 768 yards after the catch on the year, the 2nd best mark in the NFL, only behind Cooper Kupp, according to Pro Football Reference. He's by far the best wide receiver in the league in this area on a per reception basis, which makes him a more intriguing bet for fantasy leagues in 2022. Moving on to some of the concerns with Deebo Samuel's fantasy profile. New quarterback. During the 2021 season, Trey Lance completed just 57.7% of his passing attempts. In the 3 games that he played at least 50% of the snaps, his passing yards totals were 157 passing yards against the Seahawks, 192 passing yards against the Cardinals, and 249 passing yards against the Houston Texans according to fantasy data. While it's important to remember, it's only a few games, there's a very real chance that Lance's passing numbers are lower than the league average quarterbacks in 2022, which would not be great for the Niners pass catchers, like Deebo Samuel. The next thing I really am concerned about with Deebo Samuel's fantasy profile is the potential decline in carries. Last year was the perfect storm for Deebo Samuel to get a high carries workload because of the injuries to the 49ers running back room. But going into the 2022 season, Eli Mitchell, Jeff Wilson, Tyrion Davis-Price, and Trey Sermon should be healthy. Quarterback Trey Lance will also run the ball more than Jimmy Garoppolo. And most importantly, there have been some reports that Deebo Samuel doesn't want to run the ball as much in the future and prefers to be just a true wide receiver. If his carries decrease, Deebo's fantasy value would obviously take a bit of a hit. The last concern I have with Deebo Samuel's fantasy profile is a potential decline in yards per reception. Deebo Samuel led the NFL last year in yards per reception with 18.2 according to Pro Football Reference. Considering only 6 players in the entire NFL average more than 16 yards per reception, and Deebo Samuel's career average is 15.6 yards per reception, it's pretty likely that we see some natural regression in this area of efficiency in 2022. Some additional thoughts on Deebo Samuel's fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, Deebo Samuel finished as the WR2 in Standard, with 262.0 total fantasy points and 16.4 fantasy points per game. The WR2 in half PPR formats, with 300.5 total fantasy points and 18.8 fantasy points per game, and the WR3 in full PPR formats, with 339.0 total fantasy points and 21.2 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In 2020, Deebo Samuel was the WR98 in Standard, with 6.8 fantasy points per game, the WR97 in half PPR formats, with 9.2 fantasy points per game, and the WR96 in full PPR formats, with 11.5 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In 2019, Deebo Samuel was the WR26 in Standard, with 8.8 fantasy points per game, the WR29 in half PPR formats, with 10.7 fantasy points per game, and the WR31 in full PPR formats, with 12.6 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. Deebo Samuel was the best wide receiver in the league in terms of yards per target, with 11.7, yards per reception, with 18.2, fantasy points per route run, with 0.78, and fantasy points per target, with 2.82, according to Player Profiler. He also finished top 6 among wide receivers in receiving yards, total touchdowns, yards per route run, yards per team passing attempt, juke rate, and target share according to Player Profiler. Head coach Kyle Shanahan has been fairly average, or even slightly below average in terms of total usage of his wide receiver room over the course of his career, but above average in getting production out of his wide receiver rooms over the course of his career as an offensive coordinator or head coach. Deebo Samuel is listed as a medium injury risk on draft charts. His injury history at the NFL level includes a pedal foot fracture in 2020, multiple groin strains in 2019 and 2021, multiple hamstring strains in 2020, a thigh glute strain in 2021, a leg calf strain in 2021, a shin bruise in 2021, and a knee strain in 2022. Personal opinion: Deebo Samuel is going off the board as WR6, about pick 14 overall on ESPN, and WR7, about pick 21 overall on Yahoo. After doing this write-up and the research on him for this entry, it seems clear to me that Samuel is a good value at his current price. His efficiency was off the charts last year, and his yards after the catch ability has been in a whole different world than every other receiver for pretty much his entire NFL career thus far. This is a great player who's being discounted right now because of a lot of the weird off-season stuff, like the trade demand and not signing autographs at a camp, which was a camp policy. To me, he clearly belongs in that WR3 to WR6 range of elite wide receivers, alongside Jamar Chase, Devontae Adams, and Stephon Diggs, and I would feel pretty comfortable drafting him in the late first round. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Deebo Samuel created the Deebo Samuel Foundation, and it was his My Cause My Cleats in 2020. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.